Dr. Ben Danielson, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for the opportunity. It's great to see you and an honor to be part of this podcast.
Well, let's get right to the decision that you made to step away from a job that I know that you loved as the senior medical director at Odessa Brown Clinic. You'd spent so many years there. You loved the job. You were highly respected. Why walk away?
Oh, such a it painful to even keep to talk about it again. It's got a lot of content and context to it. Um, I was seeing some things that were happening with the hospital, Seattle Children's Hospital, that owns the clinic, that were definitely a divergence in values from me compared to what was happening. It was a rapidly growing hospital over the last several years and becoming a little more like a corporation than it used to be. Um, there are pieces of the ways things were done there that were not very inclusive of different kinds of voices. I was watching people who I respect and who I know are outspoken social justice advocates or outspoken for women's rights or things like that, who were kind of being nudged aside or pushed away. I experienced some things where some decisions were made that I didn't agree with, and when I con- raised my concerns about them, it seemed like that led to a sequence of things that were more like sort of coming after me, in my opinion. And there were some ongoing issues of culture around folks who were in pretty high leadership positions who had used racist language, misogynistic language, things like that. And during the COVID pandemic, there were a few instances where I really felt like the hospital really contributed to a less safe environment in the Odessa Brown Clinic. There were specific issues around patient care in the hospital, which were documented and known and had been going on for a number of years, but never really addressed, mostly around when security was being called on families, and it varied by the color of the family's skin very directly. There was a notable and statistically notable difference in that. There were things like that that really spoke to a culture that was really challenging for me. I was feeling more and more in a position that my ability to really discuss change on the inside of that organization was less and less effective. And yeah, I'm not convincing enough, or the environment didn't feel very welcoming to dissent. And over time, I started to realize that my voice was pretty much silenced within the system. Uh, Other things came up, like the realization, actually, after I left, that there had been some legal action charged against the clinic that I was never told about. Um, Maybe because they happened well before my time as medical director, but the legal action came up while I was medical director. And it was just another sign to me that it was not transparency or disclosure or inclusion or a sense of um, acknowledgement of the role that I was supposed to play. I have to say, I found lots of opportunities outside the hospital to advance and grow and things like that. And in a way, I guess I'm thankful to the hospital for sort of pushing me out of the nest, perhaps. But that's about the shortest answer I could give.
Yeah. It's interesting. At what point did Odessa Brown become part of Children's Hospital? When did that kind of joining happen?
The origin story, really from the very beginning, 50 years ago, during the civil rights era. The idea for the Odessa Brown Clinic was this combination of some seed money from a federal program called the Model Cities Program, which is trying to reinvest in inner cities around the country. And it helped a task force of community members from the central district come together and spend some time talking about what they wanted. And eventually, what they decided they wanted was healthcare for their kids in a space that felt like it was welcoming and familiar, with people that looked like them and in a location that was central in the central district. And Children's Hospital was listening to these conversations. A person named Abe Bergman, a longstanding pediatrician in this area, and a few others were really watching this develop and brought the hospital to the table, and the hospital really supported financially the clinic almost from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. And when did it become more corporatized? I mean, because that's really what we're talking about, is where a entity that services a specific community becomes just another asset for a larger medical establishment.
It gets complicated too when it's a low-income clinic that doesn't make, well, loses money. Let me be honest about that. I say invests money in the community, but I'm sure there's a hospital bean counter that just sees it as a negative. So that's even more complicated. But I think we were of reputational value all along to the hospital in different ways. I know that, supported things like fundraising in tangible ways as well. The hospital's corporatization, if that's a word, was really kind of gradual over the last 7, 8, 9, 10 years, maybe, something like that. Really moving into research much more intentionally, building on staff in ways that you went from knowing most people to not really knowing people when you pass them in the hallway. The culture, it's hard to tell when a deeper corporate culture starts to form sometimes, right? Especially if you're not at those highest offices and tables, you don't quite see that, and it takes a while to put together when something is happening that has a pattern to it. So you might think your own experience is kind of isolated until you start to hear or compare notes or understand other people's journeys. So it's hard for me to answer the when did that happen, but I do know it's I don't know, heading towards 10,000 people there, and on the employee list for the hospital, which is a pretty decent number at this point.
But yet the hospital also, as you sort of alluded to, was great for PR purposes. The fact is that it was serving the underserved. I don't know how many Lenny Wilkins Foundation events that I went to that benefited Odessa Brown, but raised a lot of money. You as the person there leading it, and even looking to build another facility, that said a lot about an important community, but yet the internal workings reflect back to what we're dealing with these days: systemic racism.
Yeah. I mean, white privilege is pervasive, especially in boards, right? I mean, that is sort of the last vestige. They're kind of untouched. And for you, being a Black doctor is daunting. I mean, because there's not many, right? And to make it as far as you have and build the reputation you have, I mean, that's quite a journey.
I'm sure I've ridden on the coattails of the clinic and the many people there and the incredible legacy that the clinic has of serving the community. So I'm sure I don't get to take credit for some of that personal reputation stuff, but the honor that to be representing that clinic or working on its behalf has been incredible. There are very few Black male doctors. There's a statistic I think I've shared a few times now that the number of Black males who are even applying to medical school is less today than it was 40 years ago. Even as the healthcare industry itself has ballooned, the actual raw number has gone down of Black male physicians. I will have to say that at Seattle Children's and at the Odessa Brown Clinic, there are some really wonderful Black women, Black and brown women, who are in different layers of support and leadership. And it's one of the things that helps me know that even though I don't get to go to the clinic every day anymore, that there are still wonderful people there who are carrying on the legacy and provide the cultural and racial representation that has been the expectation of that clinic from its beginnings.
So if you look at this, your decision to leave really was, Matt has mentioned this before in other interviews that we've done, it's sort of you've had these thousands of cuts that you've had to endure.
Yeah.
And finally, it's like, I can't be cut anymore.
Yeah.
I gotta go. I mean, I know that feeling, but that's what it comes down to.
On some levels, I'll have to say that a piece of this was also doing my own racial reckoning, as many of us were asking ourselves in our organizations to do, starting in June, and really asking myself, how am I contributing? How am I being tokenized? How am I representing myself versus the values of an organization that may be different than my own? And all of those come back to that really important word that many of us in different communities of color have to struggle with, which is complicity.
Yes.
To survive in organizations, there are always moments when you have to ask, is this me being used, or is this me being effective? And once those tables really tilt towards the being used side of it, then you if you choose to stay, then there's a complicity that comes with that you just have to wrestle with. These aren't black and white things. There aren't any bright lines between being an effective advocate and then being a tool or something.
Well, yeah, but it's more than that. It's having to code switch the higher you go at organizations, right? And at some point, how much of myself do I give up to help others? I mean, that's a real struggle.
Yeah, yeah, and realizing two really important things. One, I've had my concerns about my experiences, but the community's experiences are deeper concerns, are much more important. The stakes are just much, much higher for a low-income family who's Black, whose child has sickle cell and almost has nowhere else to go, is so reliant on this expertise and the talent, but also has to risk the culture and the bias at the same time. Those stakes are way different than mine. The second point, which is related, is just I have gotten to a space from sleeping in a van as a kid to having great privilege. I have one of those jobs that has great privilege. So before I pat myself too much on the back, the important thing is the ability to actually make a choice like that, and that is an enormous privilege in this world during this time in our history.
Yeah. And speaking of this time, right? I mean, the pandemic has laid bare the disparities in medicine and provider bias. Even now, at least they're covering is how communities of color are already being underserved. Yeah. And that white people are actually getting more vaccinations than the people that are actually needed, who are essential workers, who live in areas that are underserved. What do you think about that?
It is outrageous, and I mean that in the way that is enraging. The idea that there are hospitals here where if you're a $10,000 donor or higher, you get moved to the front of the line for your vaccine. I didn't think I lived in a society where that was actually okay, let alone possible. The idea is that we've struggled so much with vaccine distribution, and there are all of these people who have decided to place themselves in harm's way as essential workers, as bus drivers, as frontline people, as medical assistants, as all of these folks who are doing, I consider, heroic work every day. They should never have to worry about whether or not they're going to get a vaccine when they need it. We don't see the essential in our essential workers. We don't provide dignity to too many people in our society right now. And you're right that the pandemic seems to draw out every one of our basest decisions and choices. I really wonder how we need to start reflecting, looking at ourselves really closely in the mirror and asking, is this the kind of society that I wish to be supportive of?
As Matt and I have put it, that shit ain't right. And that's all we did a rant recently on our previous podcasts about all of this. And of course, I haven't been able to get a shot yet. Matt has been lucky to get one. And at this point, I've sort of just said, I'm going to wait until things are available because I'm tired of the whack-a-mole thing. I want to go back to the decision you made and what's happened since then. You make this decision; it had been building up. You decide to finally you're going to resign. You made that decision in November. You wrote a op-ed that was in the South Seattle Emerald, which I thought was very good, and I encourage people to go to the Emerald and read that, because many of the things that we've talked about here you've laid out, as well as your own looking at yourself and saying that, what do we do? You're asking other people to kind of look at this as well. It's not just your circumstance, but in the big picture of things. You're asking people to say, hey, that shit ain't right. So let's really take a hard look at it. I want to go back and I want to tell me what has happened since you made the decision to leave at Children's. They announced that they are going to have an investigation. I believe they hired Eric Holder's law firm, former Obama administration attorney general. What has transpired?
Well, I actually have to go back to October when I really told the Children's leadership that I was leaving. And I endeavored to have that be a time of negotiating and really trying to name some of the things that I really wanted to see the hospital start to do as changes as part of my leaving. And I was pretty much rebuffed in that effort. There was no openness to really talking about changes. And so for a while, I did stay quiet and tried to give every opportunity for the hospital to really come back with some ideas about changes that I felt needed to happen. I know the hospital had been contemplating some things, but had not really gotten off of the seat and started doing them. After a while, though, the hospital started to make explanations for my leaving, which I felt were really inaccurate. And that's when I felt like I had to really name why I was leaving. It was if, as much as anything else, I owed it to the Odessa Brown staff, who were shocked, didn't have a good explanation, were wondering what was going on, thought maybe I just found some better offer somewhere else, which I'd not. I was in my dream job. I never wanted to leave. But they deserved an honest explanation of what was going on. And so that was really the spark for naming those issues much more distinctly and clearly, which ended up in that op-ed as well.
Since then,
Yes.
as I mentioned, they said that they were going to have an investigation. I take it that's still ongoing?
Yeah, so they tried to do an internal investigation first and a few other things. And to your point, Matt, it felt like there was some corporate crisis response management happening rather than, oh my gosh, we really need to do something. We need to own this, acknowledge it, reckon with it, and build something different. So that was kind of happening for a while. I could probably rant on about just the ways corporations need to hold their power so closely that they actually make it hard to think about changing.
Well, they were already going through some crisis with the conditions in their operating rooms, and then this happened, and they're in the midst of a capital campaign. So it's like perfect storm of just trying to hold the space and covering.
So true. The stakeholders that have been supporting the clinic and supporting the hospital were really instrumental in making the consultative assessment from the Eric Holder team become the plan rather than a purely internal investigation. But I do think that there is something about the culture that connects the issues of the OR and the issues that I've been talking about and the experiences of other people who've left the hospital. There's something about being afraid of transparency, of having difficulty managing negative situations well. I was talking about it earlier today as almost throwback previous generation corporate decision making. you do a few sacrificial fires, you start to try to get a message out in front of people, you try to manage instead of address. And I hope there's some learning in there for either other organizations or for children's as well. I don't mean to say I'm the teacher of how corporations function, but I do think that there's some introspection that needs to happen. We've seen similar things, right, with CBS
Yeah.
and with other hospitals around the country and with a couple of other smaller businesses and things going through this.
Now, you had said that there was a particular individual at the management level that called you the N-word and used other derogatory words. Though you did not name that person, Children's did when they announced that they were firing Dr. Jim Hendricks. He was the president of Seattle Children's Research Institute. You didn't mention him, but was that at the heart of a lot of your angst?
I don't want to get too nuanced about this. There was that a person at that level of leadership could really behave in that way towards women, towards many different parts of communities of color, and that it seemed to be supported. And it's that second point that it felt like the hospital allowed, almost approved of that kind of culture. My sense was when they looked into it, when it was first sort of bubbling up and a whistleblower talked about it, the way the hospital top leadership at the time came back was, why are you upset about some cussing, some swear words?
Well, if you're a person of color, and listen, I'm a brown guy, a Mexican-American guy, but I've been called the N-word because I'm dark skinned. And let me tell you, I would be pretty pissed. And I'm not just going to that's just not cussing, people. Come on.
Especially at that level.
Oh, yeah. That is, yeah. Right.
That's hateful speech.
It is. That's like the lowest of the low.
Sends a message to everyone else who's anywhere below that person in the organization that this is what we approve of. They say now that, when they investigated it back then, they found no wrongdoing.
It ain't just cussing. I mean, come on, people.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think society in general right now is lacking a lot of profiles and courage.
Yeah.
I mean, and kind of is why we are here. I mean, we need people to stand up at all levels. I mean, you would think that they would have learned something from this summer and the Black Lives Matter protests, right? That people are not happy with things. They're not going to accept it. And yet this conduct happens at the hospital, a place that most people hold sacred. Children's
Hospital, yeah. And for me, one of those slashes that you mentioned, Enrique, was a sort of platitudinous, symbolic set of statements that many organizations around us were making at the time. But one of them was Seattle Children's Hospital. And a group of us really said, if you're serious about this, these are the things you should be doing. And again, it felt like there was no response to that.
Yeah. Matt mentions that children's was sacred. I got to note that my daughter had to have emergency surgery. She had it at Children's when she was 6 years old. That was a frightening experience for us. I have a young cousin whose son battled cancer. Is a 2-year-old, and he survived, and Children's came through really to be there for you. You count on that organization. You count on them to provide good medical care for people of all colors. So, again, this is, it's just maddening to have this happen. I want to know one other question about this is that have you been asked anything as part of their investigations anymore about?
No, I think at some point maybe the Eric Holder Group, Covington firm, I think it is, may want to hear from me, but so far nothing from them. I know they've put out, this is weird to me though, they put it on the children's website, an opportunity for people to sign up to provide content. I just, if you're not from part of children's, it feels a little bit harder to actually even provide your words. I wanted to say two things about what you were talking about on an emotional level just a second ago too. This is a compliment to Children's Hospital, in my view, when I say that the women who started that hospital 110 years ago or something, 114 years maybe, a few years into the hospital's existence, they made a statement that Children's Hospital would serve children of any race, religion, or creed, regardless of their ability to pay. I know we say that now pretty easily among many organizations, but I have to believe that in 1915, that was a bold social justice kind of statement for a new hospital to make. They did that partly because Black and brown women came to them and said, our daughters and our sons have these conditions, but we don't know how we would pay for this. I am so proud that Children's was born as a hospital under that kind of a mission. It also means I hold them to that mission completely, and they don't get to sort of grow away from that, in my view. But thank you for reminding me of that point. And I would say there are great, great doctors, great people at Seattle Children's Hospital.
That's
Martin
right.
Luther King
Yeah.
said, groups are more immoral than individuals are. And we all know we've worked in spaces and places where people are great, but the overall culture from an organizational level is not as great.
Well, now that everybody's on record, what's in store for Odessa Brown? Are they going to survive? Are they going to make it through this? Are they going to be able to serve the community they set out to?
I think they are in good hands from a leadership perspective there. I think this team there is been wounded, not by my leaving, but by all the other stuff that's going on around, but are so strong, so amazing. You know, I spent every day with those folks from March 1st up until December, and we know each other on a level that you never would have known in a working relationship otherwise. Those are incredible, dedicated people. The clinic was intended to be an arm's length away from the hospital, to benefit from the hospital's financial support, but be accountable to the community. That was the original intention in my reading. And this may be an opportunity to really talk about returning some of that accountability to the community voice, the community input, the ability to make decisions. When I got hired 21 years ago, I had to sit with a community panel, and they grilled me. It was the hardest interview I can imagine. But it also told me that I was accountable to the community more than to the hospital. They don't do that anymore in their hiring practices. And just as one small example of returning power to the community is the key to Odessa Brown's future as a continued gem for the Black and brown and low-income kids that have always gone there. I think that's important. And I think there are other clinics that also just are saying we need a stronger community voice now.
And the satellite facility that's being built, the other clinic, is it moving along?
It's moving along. It's been, so incredibly supported by so many different people. I think the plan is wonderful. It's a space that really recreates the idea of it takes a village to raise a child, and it's so different from the way your typical hospital would have designed a clinic. It's really built for support, interaction. It's built so that there's transparency. There's that word again, and it's built so that young people would see older people that look like them all around them, working and doing their thing instead of hiding around in little cubbies and offices and stuff like that. I think it's a bold model, and I think it is living into the kind of mentorship that a place like that is supposed to be. I really do feel like there are wonderful people in that clinic, and they deserve a lot of support, because I know in my own guilty way that some of my actions have contributed to a lot of their suffering right now.
So what's next for you? You're at the UW Medical Center now.
Yeah, I'm still sort of figuring that out, but I did have to change my sort of practice plan in order to be able to stay in Seattle. And that's a whole nother podcast about how I was able to stay in Seattle. There were a lot of forces that were forcing me to actually leave. but I'm glad to be able to stay under the umbrella of the UW. And I hope to basically start a center there that addresses the issue of youth incarceration in our communities. I'm hoping to work with other people who are smarter and better and greater than me and put an end to youth incarceration in our county and then in our state, and then partner with other states doing this work like California and make it a national movement. Adolescents' brains are still developing, are still being refined. The traumas that young people face influence the way they make decisions. If we are saying that we need to have a public health lens when we look at some of these issues, then that's the public health that we need to be looking at. All that we know about youth detention is that it helps to create people who are going to be in adult prisons. It labels kids as criminals, it criminalizes kids that are labeled as criminals, and it helps them become adult criminals. Every data piece shows that it doesn't work. And so I can't imagine why we continue to put adolescents in jails.
Is this important to you because of your own upbringing? Weren't you in foster care at one point in your life?
Briefly, but I've been so fortunate to have so many good people around me that despite my strong tendencies to and almost intentions to be in trouble with people.
Were you a bad boy when you were younger, Doc?
I was not a good boy.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, okay, now we can't just stop and you just kind of allude to this. So, okay, where did you grow up?
I grew up in DC for the most part till high school, and I was raised by a single white mom and with two white sisters. And I know my mom just moved us to inner city DC because she wanted to make sure I grew up within a Black culture that she couldn't provide, and that I had different kinds of adult mentorship and stuff like that. And I took that a little bit far and started skipping school and hanging out on the corners and doing all that kind of stuff. And there were people on the streets that took me in, that took care of me, that taught me the lessons that you need to learn from brown communities, taught me the twice as good speech and the other things that help you navigate a world that isn't friendly to you in many ways. And I know you know what I mean, both of you, when I say that. So I've had a lot of rescuing in my time. So I will never compare my experiences to youth who've aged out of foster care, or who've been in and out of different homes, or who have not had the opportunity to see their educational potential fully revealed.
Yeah. But is it a motivating factor for what you do today, though? Now, what you're trying to do at the U?
Yeah, and it is still a health issue. The spiral that gets you suspended from schools, even in preschool if you're Black or brown, and the spirals that draw you towards being seen as a criminal by the systems around you are the same things that ensure that your health is never going to be as good, and that your lifespan is going to be different, and that the opportunities to be well is just not there. And there was a Surgeon General from many years ago, Shirley Caldwell, I want to say, who said something like, you can't educate an unhealthy child and you can't keep an uneducated child healthy. And if I'm a pediatrician trying to do health, then I better be involved in the other things that are actually so important, more important than healthcare, that actually impact a child's health.
So at the U, are you going to be the regular Dr. Ben, seeing babies and young people as a pediatrician would, as well as working on these other issues?
I found throughout my career so far that seeing patients, well, it's super selfish and it's soul lifting, and it's just makes you feel connected in so many important ways. And it also makes whatever you're trying to do at some system level or population level much better informed. The experiences you learn from in your direct care makes you better at thinking about advocacy, and the things that you do in advocacy hopefully make you better in those moments when you're directly looking at a young person or a family in front of you and trying to support them in any way they tell you they need.
Yeah. So you were thinking about leaving town, but then they grabbed you and pulled you into the U, which where you went to medical school, right?
Yeah, yeah. People came to really help me out. My wife and I were ready to move to California, and we're, pretty close to having a job there. So I'm very thankful that at least I get to stay connected to the community that I've loved and is beloved to me in so many ways.
Well, thank you for your resiliency. I mean, this is a perfect example of the resiliency brown people need in this society.
Yeah. And,
Yeah, but there are many stronger people. The people who really just need to get through the day and use all of their logic skills, all their navigation skills, all their resiliency tanks in order to make sure their children have a roof over their head and they have food on the table. Um, I think those are the heroes, right?
well, Doc, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us, to tell us what happened. And I hope that actually something does happen in the end to make some changes at Seattle Children's, which, I appreciate as a parent so much. And I know that so many other people do and depend on it. But let's face it, that's unacceptable to have systemic racism and ignore it. I hope they really do take this seriously. And the other thing is that I'm very thankful that you're not leaving Seattle, partly because
Yes.
we want to have you come back on the podcast. Yeah.
Definitely. I'm still trying to learn a lot about the complicity thing and where I need to show up better in my life and the lives of people around me. So maybe figure out that more and I can come back and we can talk about that because I'll bet we all have life experiences
Yep.
that would just be really interesting to share together, wouldn't it?
Well, I
Yep.
think that's why Matt and I are doing this podcast, because it's our therapy. The fact that maybe we feel like we haven't done enough, and in a way, we're trying to give back to the community, but also to talk to people like you that to give us hope and to give us some sense of direction. And people, let's all get our act together and
Yes.
force those organizations that need to do better. But thank you so much, Dr. Danielson.
Thank you, Dr. Danielson.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Okay, therapy's over.